The office had always been Evelyn's sanctuary, a cocoon of warm tones, soft lighting, and the faint scent of lavender wafting from a discreet diffuser on her desk. Her chair, worn just right, creaked familiarly as she leaned back, scanning her notes. She had prepared thoroughly, as she always did, but there was something unsettling about today's session. The patient had arrived unannounced 2 weeks ago, slipping into her receptionist's schedule with an unusual urgency. He gave no full name, only Daniel, and his intake forms were bare. Evelyn had considered declining him as a client, but something in his voice on the phone, a disarming mix of confidence and vulnerability, had caught her off guard. Now, as the door opened, Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Daniel stepped in, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. His presence was magnetic, almost too familiar. "Dr. Carter," he said, offering a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me." Evelyn gestured to the armchair across from her. "Please, have a seat." He moved with deliberate precision, lowering himself into the chair and meeting her gaze with a steadiness that made her skin prickle. His dark eyes, sharp yet weary, seemed to scrutinize her as much as she did him. "I usually start with a simple question," Evelyn began, her voice calm. "What brings you here today?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers brushing the armrests of the chair. "You could say I've been lost," he said slowly. "Or maybe that I've lost something, pieces of myself." His words hung in the air, ambiguous yet strangely poignant. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, pen poised. "Pieces of yourself?" "Yes," he said, his gaze drifting to the window. "Memories, places, times. Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life, or maybe they're living mine." Evelyn noted the way his voice dropped on the last word, as if it carried more weight than he intended. "Have you experienced any gaps in your memory, events you can't recall?" His eyes flicked back to hers, narrowing slightly. "Perhaps," he said cryptically. "But that's not the strange part." Evelyn resisted the urge to press him. "What feels strange to you?" Daniel's lips curved into a faint, almost sardonic smile. "How familiar everything is." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She straightened in her chair, fighting the irrational sensation that he was speaking directly to her, on a level she didn't yet understand. For the next hour, Daniel recounted fragmented stories, dreamlike vignettes of wandering darkened streets, entering rooms that felt like echoes of forgotten memories, and seeing faces he swore he should know, but couldn't name. There was a rhythm to his speech, hypnotic and unsettling. By the time the session ended, Evelyn felt like she had been pulled into a tide she couldn't escape. When Daniel left, she stood at her window, watching as his figure disappeared into the gray fog outside. A question gnawed at her. Why did everything he described feel like something she had once experienced herself? It began with small things. Evelyn would find herself staring at her desk, unable to remember picking up the pen in her hand or starting the notes she was reading. Once, she walked into her office to see her favorite mug on the edge of her desk, half full with cold coffee, except she hadn't brewed any that morning. Daniel's sessions grew more disconcerting. Each time he spoke, his stories seemed to shift, mirroring snippets of Evelyn's own life with unsettling accuracy. One day, he described a bookshop she had frequented as a student, down to the peculiar bell on the door and the grizzled shopkeeper who always wore mismatched socks. "How do you know about that place?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Daniel tilted his head, his expression neutral. "It just came to me. Strange, isn't it?" The sense of unreality deepened when she started waking up in unfamiliar places within her own home. She would find herself standing in the kitchen late at night, staring at the flickering light of the refrigerator. Or she would wake on the couch, her laptop open to an article she didn't remember searching for. Evelyn rationalized it as stress, a heavy caseload, the emotional toll of her profession. It was all catching up to her. Yet deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing unease that Daniel's presence had stirred. The breaking point came on a quiet Thursday evening. She had stayed late to review patient files, the office bathed in the dim glow of her desk lamp. When she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror by the door. It wasn't right. Her reflection stood still while she moved, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. A ripple passed through its features, and for a fleeting second, Evelyn swore she saw Daniel's face staring back at her. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. When she looked again, the reflection was normal. Her own pale face, wide eyes, and disheveled hair staring back. Evelyn left the office in a daze, her mind spinning with fragmented thoughts. As she drove home, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple, but chilling. "You're closer than you think." Evelyn didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, her phone was glowing on the bedside table. The time read 3:12 a.m., and a single message blinked on the screen. "Look under the drawer." Her chest tightened. She stared at the text, willing it to make sense. The number was blocked, untraceable. After a long moment, she swung her legs over the bed and walked to her desk. The air in her home felt colder than it should, and the quiet seemed almost oppressive. Hesitating, she knelt and opened the bottom drawer. There was nothing unusual. Patient files neatly stacked, a few pens rolling loose at the bottom. Her breath hitched as she ran her fingers along the interior. A thin sheet of paper was tucked beneath the drawer lining. It crinkled faintly as she pulled it free. It was a map. The ink was faded, the lines drawn with an unsteady hand. There were no street names or landmarks, just winding paths that seemed to overlap in a maze of directions. At the center was a small X, drawn in black ink. The sight of it sent a chill crawling up her spine. She didn't recognize the map, nor could she fathom how it had found its way into her home. The following day, Evelyn resolved to bring it up during Daniel's session. Her hands trembled as she placed the map on the table between them. "Does this mean anything to you?" she asked. Daniel's gaze dropped to the paper, and his lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Interesting," he murmured. "You found it." "Found it?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, the faint sound of the leather creaking under him. "You've been walking the paths for weeks, didn't you notice?" The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer as his words sank in. Evelyn's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep her composure. "Explain." Daniel tilted his head, watching her with the quiet intensity of a predator studying its prey. "Every choice you've made, the way home, the places you've visited, it all leads back to this." He tapped the map lightly, his fingers lingering on the X. "But you've already been there, haven't you?" The accusation froze her. She hadn't. She couldn't have. And yet, as she stared at the map, fragmented images began to surface, vivid flashes of a narrow alley, a broken lamppost, the cold press of stone walls. Evelyn gripped the edge of the table, her breathing uneven. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You will," Daniel said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. "You just have to keep walking." Evelyn couldn't let it rest. The map, the cryptic messages, the disorienting gaps in her memory, it all pointed to something just out of reach. She became consumed by the thought that the answers were hiding in plain sight, waiting for her to unravel them. She found herself driving late into the evening, tracing the winding streets of the city without direction. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as her headlights illuminated desolate alleys and empty storefronts. The streets grew narrower, darker, until she reached a dead end. Her heart sank as she recognized the surroundings. It was the alley from her fractured memories, the broken lamppost casting an anemic glow, the damp stone walls lined with faded graffiti. At the far end, a rusted metal door stood ajar, its edges warped as if by great force. Evelyn stepped out of the car, the sound of her shoes echoing on the uneven pavement. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, charged with an invisible hum that prickled her skin. She approached the door, her breath shallow as she pushed it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, its concrete walls cracked and stained. The only object was a desk, old and splintered, its surface covered with scattered papers and a single ticking clock. The clock was antique, its face yellowed with age, and its hands moving in erratic, uneven jerks. Evelyn's pulse raced as she realized the time it displayed. 11:59. The moment she stepped closer, the clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent, until it was the only sound in the room. The second hand seemed to struggle against an invisible force, the tension mounting as it inched toward 12. A memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. She was sitting in this room, how long ago she couldn't say, scribbling something onto a piece of paper. Her hands moved quickly, feverishly, as though driven by an urgency she couldn't explain. The memory faded, leaving her with the sharp sting of déjà vu. The clock struck midnight. Its chime reverberated through the small space, a haunting melody that made the walls seem to tremble. The papers on the desk fluttered as if caught in a breeze, and Evelyn's eyes widened as she saw what they contained. They were her own notes, written in her handwriting, detailing sessions she couldn't remember conducting. Each page chronicled fragments of Daniel's stories, interwoven with strange symbols and drawings she didn't recognize. Her chest tightened as she turned the pages, each revelation more disturbing than the last. One note stood out, written in bold, looping script. "This isn't real." Behind her, the sound of soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. Evelyn spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The doorway was empty, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, crawling along the floor toward her. She grabbed the notes and fled, the ticking of the clock chasing her into the night. Evelyn locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her apartment felt foreign, too still, too quiet. The notes she had taken from the room were clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She stumbled to her desk, spreading them out in the faint glow of the lamp. The papers were a labyrinth of cryptic scrawls and fragmented sentences, each more haunting than the last. Among the illegible lines were sharp, deliberate messages. "Do not trust him. He is you. Follow the clock. Time is a circle." Evelyn's chest tightened as the words blurred together. Each message felt as though it had been written not just for her, but by her. The familiarity was undeniable, yet impossible to accept. Her memories unraveled, slipping between her fingers like fine sand. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows gathering in the corners, pressing closer. The ticking sound began again, faint at first, then growing louder until it filled the room. It wasn't coming from a clock. It was coming from within her. She bolted upright, her pulse hammering as she glanced around. The walls appeared to ripple faintly, the paint cracking in thin, spidery lines. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, and she froze. It wasn't her. The figure mirrored her movements, but with a distorted, almost exaggerated precision. Its eyes were darker, hollowed, and its smile stretched unnaturally wide, splitting its face into an expression of cruel amusement. Evelyn's breath hitched as the reflection leaned closer, pressing its palms against the glass. "You're almost there," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The voice came from all around her, a chorus of her own tones layered with something deeper, something cold and alien. Evelyn stumbled back, the desk digging into her spine. The papers scattered to the floor, their words glowing faintly in the dim light. The phrase, "He is you," burned brighter than the rest, pulsating like a heartbeat. She grabbed one of the pages and flipped it over. On the back was a crude drawing of the clock she'd seen in the hidden room. The image shimmered, as if alive, the hands spinning wildly. Below it was a single instruction: confront him at the strike of 12. Her gaze darted to the clock on her wall. The second hand inched closer to midnight, its rhythmic clicking echoing in the suffocating silence. The weight of inevitability pressed on her chest. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew she couldn't hide. Not anymore. Evelyn grabbed her coat and the map, ignoring the pounding in her chest as she left her apartment. The streets were deserted, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The map seemed to guide her steps, though she didn't consciously follow it. Every turn, every shadowed alley led her back to the place she feared most. The door to the hidden room stood ajar, its edges glowing faintly as if inviting her in. Her steps echoed as she entered, her breath clouding in the unnaturally cold air. The clock was waiting. Its face glowed faintly in the darkness, the hands frozen at 1 minute to midnight. As Evelyn stepped closer, the ticking grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening. And then, he appeared. Daniel stood on the other side of the clock, his figure distorted, as though seen through warped glass. His face was calm, his dark eyes watching her with unnerving clarity. "You've found the truth," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "But it's not what you think." Evelyn's knees threatened to give way, but she held her ground. "Who are you? What is this?" Daniel tilted his head, his lips curving into a small smile. "I'm you, Evelyn. Or rather, the version of you that never escaped this cycle." She shook her head, her voice rising. "You're lying. This is impossible." "It's the truth you've been running from," he said, stepping closer. "Every choice, every moment, every thought, it's all part of the same loop. Time is a circle, and you're trapped in its center." The clock began to chime, each toll reverberating through the room. Midnight. Evelyn's vision blurred, the room spinning as the echoes of the bell surrounded her. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's expression softened, almost mournful. "That depends on you." The air seemed to shift, the walls dissolving into darkness as the clock's glow consumed everything. Evelyn felt weightless, her mind splitting between fear and an odd sense of calm. The chime faded, leaving only silence. When she opened her eyes, she was sitting in her office. The chair across from her was empty, save for a faint impression on the cushion, as if someone had just been there. Her desk was clear, no notes, no map, nothing to suggest the nightmare had been real. Yet, as she turned to the mirror by the door, her reflection lingered a beat too long before following her.